This is one of Vincent van Gogh's most famous paintings, but there's something wrong with it. The flowers you're looking at are blue. Van Gogh painted them violet. And for more than a century, nobody could prove exactly what had happened. Today, scientists think they know. And they've digitally reconstructed what this painting probably looked like when Van Gogh finished it in 1889. I'll show you that version later. And once you see it beside the painting hanging in the Getty today, the difference is surprisingly dramatic. In May 1889, Vincent van Gogh arrived at Saint-Paul-de-Moselle, a psychiatric hospital in the south of France. He had admitted himself voluntarily after one of the most difficult periods of his life. For his first weeks there, he wasn't allowed to leave the hospital grounds, but inside the walls was a large, overgrown garden. And almost immediately, Van Gogh started painting it. One of the first works he began was this: irises. Rather than painting a traditional landscape, Van Gogh got incredibly close to the flowers. There's almost no sense of distance, no horizon, no vase. The irises are still rooted in the earth, and they fill nearly the entire canvas. But shortly after starting the painting, Van Gogh wrote to his brother Theo. In the letter, he mentioned two paintings he was working on. One was a lilac bush. The other, he said, was of violet irises, which is strange, because the flowers in the painting today are clearly blue. For decades, that contradiction was easy to dismiss. Maybe Van Gogh simply described the color loosely. Maybe the flowers looked more violet to him in person. But there was a reason art historians found that explanation unsatisfying. Van Gogh thought about color constantly. He studied how complementary colors intensify one another. Red beside green, orange beside blue, and especially yellow beside violet. Now look again at irises. You have reddish soil against green leaves, yellow and orange flowers sitting behind the main irises. And if those irises were originally violet, they would create exactly the kind of yellow-violet contrast Van Gogh loved. So perhaps he hadn't made a mistake in his letter at all. Perhaps the painting itself had changed. The problem was proving it. Then, in 2020, something unusual happened. The Getty Museum closed during the pandemic. Normally, irises is almost constantly on display. But with the galleries empty, conservators finally had the opportunity to take the painting off the wall and study it closely. Under a microscope, researchers noticed something embedded in the paint, a tiny piece of organic material. At first, they weren't even sure what it was. Later, conservator Davy Ormond and scientist Catherine Patterson traveled to Saint-Paul-de-Moselle, where Van Gogh had painted the work. The hospital still exists. And when they entered the garden, they noticed tiny pollen cones scattered beneath the umbrella pine trees. They closely resembled the object trapped in Van Gogh's paint. More than 130 years earlier, one of these tiny pieces of plant material had apparently blown onto his canvas, while the paint was still wet. Van Gogh then painted over it. It was a tiny physical connection between the painting and the exact garden where it had been made. But the bigger mystery remained. Where had the violet gone? To answer that, researchers analyzed the chemical elements in the paint. Across the blue petals, they detected bromine. That was important because bromine pointed to a pigment called geranium lake. Geranium lake was red. Van Gogh mixed red pigments like this with blue to create violet. But geranium lake had a serious weakness. It fades when exposed to light. Over decades, the red component gradually broke down. The blue pigments remained, so the flowers didn't suddenly change from violet to blue. It happened incredibly slowly, year after year, a tiny amount of red disappearing until eventually the violet Van Gogh had painted became the blue we see today. And then researchers found an even stronger clue. In one tiny part of the painting, some of the upper surface had been lost. Underneath was paint that had been protected from the light. And that protected paint was still purple, a tiny surviving glimpse of Van Gogh's original color. There was also evidence from someone who saw the painting when it was new. In September 1889, French critic Félix Fénéon reviewed the work. He described the flowers as violet. So now the evidence started to stack up. Van Gogh himself called them violet. Scientists found the remains of a faded red pigment inside the petals, and protected paint underneath the surface was still purple. A critic who saw the painting in 1889 called them violet. The blue flowers we know today were almost certainly not what Van Gogh originally painted. But researchers wanted to go one step further. They wanted to know what the whole painting might have looked like in 1889. So they spent months creating a digital reconstruction. They mapped where the fading pigments had originally been, and estimated how strongly those colors would have appeared before more than a century of light exposure. And this was the result. This is their best estimate of what Van Gogh's irises originally looked like. Now place it beside the painting today. The most obvious difference is the flowers. Instead of blue, the irises become deeper violet and purple. But there are other changes too. Some of the small flowers in the background become warmer and more intense, and the entire painting suddenly has stronger color contrast. The violet pushes against the yellow. The red pushes against the green. The relationships Van Gogh was deliberately building into the painting become much easier to see. And that's what makes the reconstruction so interesting. For generations, millions of people have looked at the faded version and assumed it was exactly what Van Gogh intended. It appeared in books, on posters, on postcards, on mugs and tote bags. Eventually, blue irises simply became part of how the world remembered the painting. But Van Gogh himself had already told us the truth. He wrote it down in 1889, violet irises. There's something strange about realizing that famous paintings aren't as permanent as they seem. We tend to think that once an artist finishes a work, it remains frozen forever. But paintings are physical objects. Pigments react with light, chemicals break down, colors fade, and sometimes those changes happen so slowly that no living person ever notices them happening. One generation sees a slightly altered painting, then the next sees one that has changed a little more. Eventually, the altered version becomes the version everyone assumes was original. In this case, it took modern science, a museum closed by a pandemic, and a few tiny traces of pigment to finally prove what Van Gogh had been telling us all along. So the next time you see irises, remember, the blue flowers are beautiful, but they were never supposed to be blue.